To everyone for coming. So our series of talks on the atlases of William Hacke and related derroteros and activity in the Pacific Ocean in the late 17th and 18th century continues today with a talk by Katie Parker titled William Hacke's Manuscript Atlases and London in the Production of Pacific Geographic Knowledge 1650 to 1750. Katie earned her PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and defended her thesis in 2016. The title of her thesis was closely related to the subject of her thesis was closely related to the subject of her talk today. The title was Contentious Waters: The Creation of Pacific Geographic Knowledge in Britain, 1669 to 1768. And she is the research officer for Barry Lawrence Ruderman Rare Maps, which is a rare map dealer in Southern California, specifically in the San Diego area. So without further ado, Katie, I'll pass the word to you, and we look forward to your talk with great anticipation. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Chet. So hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing all right during the pandemic. I'm very grateful to Chet for the opportunity to share some of my research with you all. It's part of a hopefully upcoming book manuscript that is supposed to come out this year or next, so we'll see how that goes. I'm really excited to share this, although I did choose a rather wide topic. Maybe it's not great to try and put an entire, well, not the entire book argument, but a lot of it into one 45-minute paper. So I hope it all works out. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to give the talk in English, in English, and I'm going to be very happy to respond to questions afterwards. And I hope that you have some questions. All right, let's share the screen and get going. All right, someone wave wildly at me if that is not working. Okay, so the manuscript nautical atlases of William Hacke are lavish, beautiful objects. They are stunning examples of craftsmanship and artistry, and viewing them in person is a highlight of any researcher's archival work. I've been lucky enough to view examples at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, the British Library, and the John Carter Brown Library. And I've seen images of examples at the Huntington and the Clements Library. Today, I want to dwell less on the material qualities of the atlases themselves, and rather focus on the circumstances of their creation and their circulation. I wish to use the works of William Hacke, the manuscript atlases, and his printed voyage collection as an example of a wider phenomenon. The production of the Hacke atlases marks a transitional moment in how Europeans sought and packaged and shared texts, maps, charts, and atlases, all of which showed the South Seas, a topic of importance to geopolitics, commerce, navigation, and natural philosophy. Prior to the late 17th century, England had been a marginal presence in both the gathering and creation of Pacific geographic knowledge, although they were certainly interested in attaining such information. After the piratical voyages that captured the Spanish materials upon which Hacke's atlases are based, however, England, and London specifically, came to increasing prominence in both the sending of voyages to the Pacific and in the creation of geographic material culture based upon those voyages. Hacke, therefore, is a particularly important node in a network that, around 1690, was only just beginning to coalesce. By 1750, the members of this geographic knowledge network would be set, but they were still experimenting with their preferred form for sharing their knowledge. In order to examine the geographic knowledge network and Hacke's role within it, this paper will have 3 parts that focus on different scales. First, I will briefly outline the trans-imperial production of Pacific geographic knowledge up to the late 17th century. Second, I will lay out the actors involved in this London-based network of geographic knowledge, a network that would come to dominate the distribution and regulation of Pacific geographic knowledge by 1750. Third, I will offer brief snapshots of the publications of John Narborough, William Hacke, and George Anson to show the dynamic interaction of this informal and interdependent network over time. These first two sections are broad overviews of absolutely huge topics and are therefore necessarily simplifications of very complex ideas. They are, of course, exceptions to the interpretations I offer here, and I'm happy to discuss those afterwards. So part one. Hacke is most famous today for the stylish and skilled copying of a Spanish derrotero captured by pirates in the South Seas. The very fact that derroteros were items considered worthy of stealing is instructive, as it shows the value placed on geographic knowledge by overseas empires. It also suggests that early modern states regulated and controlled the circulation of their geographic knowledge. Much of this information will already be known to many of you, but I think it's important to review the spectrum of censorship and security attached to geographic knowledge across Western Europe by the end of the 17th century. Both Spain and Portugal had operated centralized repositories for maps, charts, and geographic texts for centuries by the time Hacke was working. These centers were staffed by state-employed intellectuals who were also tasked with the training and equipping of pilots and navigators, who in turn ensured that the empire's commerce sailed smoothly and efficiently. Both institutions, the Casa de la Contratación in Spain and the Armacém in Portugal, operated as approval boards for maps and texts. Their review was required before charts and books could be issued to the public, either in manuscript or in print. This allowed for censorship as well as quality control. While never an entirely closed archive, both the Armacém and the Casa maintained strict control over geographic knowledge. There was certainly the occasional leak, but information was usually shared only with official approval, much to the consternation of other European states and individuals alike. The Dutch also regulated the circulation of geographic knowledge, but with a very different organizational structure. The primary actor at work in this case was not the Dutch state, but the Dutch East India Company. The company named official hydrographers who were also private businessmen. While at times the company would decide that certain information should not be shared beyond their meetings, the need for updated charts and maps, as well as the public-facing nature of their hydrographers, meant that information made its way into publicly available works with relative frequency, usually after a short delay. In France, geographers also had a dual role as private businessmen and state employees. The Crown funded Géographe du Roi, who provided the state with geographic materials, but who also sold their wares to a market that stretched across Europe. By contrast, the domestic map-making industry in England only began to flourish in the second half of the 17th century. Most practitioners were trained engravers who later specialized in geographic prints, a stark contrast to France's geographers or Spain's cosmographers. Additionally, while the English trade was the most centralized in terms of geographic concentration, it was focused on just several streets within London, it was the least centralized institutionally. Very few mapmakers were members of the Stationers' Company who oversaw the registration of printed materials. There was no centralized map repository in Britain until 1795. Individual lawmakers and some government entities, such as the Board of Trade and Plantations, did have collections of maps and charts, but their contents and maintenance fluctuated wildly based on personnel. While select mapmakers did get to use the title of geographer or hydrographer to the king, this title came with little to no financial support or privileges. The main goal here is to grasp that censorship and security of geographic knowledge was nowhere absolute, but it existed on a spectrum that ran from tightly controlled to relatively open. By the late 17th century, England was beginning to operate more prominently as a clearinghouse for Pacific geographic knowledge. This is not because they sent the most voyages to the region. The Spanish regularly traversed the South Seas, and in the period 1695 to 1725, 168 French voyages traveled to the Pacific. By comparison, only 4 English voyages entered the world's largest ocean between 1700 and 1725. However, of these 4 voyages, 6 voyage accounts with accompanying maps were published. It is this crucial difference, the frequency and density of publicly available geographic knowledge streaming out of London, that set Britain apart and ultimately helped them to claim a major role in the colonization of the South Seas. To transition from a trans-imperial to a national level, now I would like to explain in more detail this London-centric geographic knowledge network. Due to late 17th and early 18th century naval reforms that are actually quite boring, so I won't go into them, the Royal Navy, and more specifically its governing body, the Admiralty, became the main arbiter in the commissioning of exploratory expeditions. It established partnerships to share geographic information with other organizations like the Royal Society. For charts and geographic descriptions, the Admiralty relied on the private mapmaking industry. Together, then, these three groups dominated the collection, compilation, and distribution of geographic knowledge about the Pacific. In the 17th and 18th centuries, government departments often turned to outside organizations to fill gaps in resources and expertise. Although there was never a formal contract between them, there was considerable crossover between the Admiralty and the Royal Society, for instance at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and on the Board of Longitude. Whereas the Admiralty focused on discovering trade routes and ports, the Royal Society was interested in collecting and cataloging a more complete understanding of the globe, and that's a paraphrase of their charter. The focus on natural philosophy allowed the Royal Society to develop a lively correspondence with savants and academies abroad, including overseas trading companies and the Académie des Sciences in France. Fellows of the Royal Society often received specialized information about foreign voyages to which the Admiralty was not privy. As part of their interest in understanding the natural order, the Royal Society was also curious about cartography and geography. While the Royal Society served as a repository for maps and geographic texts, the real center of geographic knowledge creation in British society was the private publishing industry. The mapmakers of Britain had to seek private funds to finance costly operations, from survey and compilation to engraving and printing. British geographers sought noble patronage or subscriptions to subsidize their complex and costly endeavors. For faraway places, mapmakers depended on descriptions from interviews, published voyage accounts, or specialized periodicals. However, many of these sources were not complete enough to create useful charts, a fact much lamented by mapmakers who were important critics of the limits of geographic knowledge. Private patrons and the government occasionally commissioned specific maps. However, mapmakers relied primarily on the consumer market to pay back their investment, and this affected which items were printed. Although this short overview masks the complex interchange between consumer and mapmaker, it indicates the presence of a larger community interested in cartographic information. As numerous scholars have pointed out, there was an increasing awareness of natural philosophy as a source of credible information within the British reading public in the early 18th century. Readers can inform themselves better than ever before about experimental science and empirical methods as a way to describe the world, and this was reflected in their choice of reading. Travel accounts were becoming increasingly empirical in the presentation of their findings, which encouraged readers to participate in the language of the new sciences that were popular within urban lecture halls, coffee houses, and salons. Consumers were interested in natural philosophy and cartography as commodities and as a way to think about their world. The reading public, although not central to the planning of expeditions, were an audience for geographic knowledge that had to be attended to by those who wished to profit from this new appreciation of precise, credible, and useful knowledge. British geographic knowledge creation, therefore, was an interdependent yet informal process driven by the market. Part of this larger market for geographic knowledge included naval officers who were required to provide themselves with the instruments, maps, charts, and books necessary for a voyage. Fellows of the Royal Society also relied on printed charts in their own work and as part of their general mission to gather knowledge about the known world. Whereas the Admiralty and the Royal Society were dependent on mapmakers and geographers for published material about the world, mapmakers in turn were in need of new information which the Royal Society's international correspondence and the Admiralty's voyages could provide. So where is the Pacific in all of this? To bring together parts 1 and 2, British mapmakers relied on the work of international rivals like Sanson, which we see one of his dual polar charts here, and allies alike to verify their own placement of features while creating products for market. Map consumers, including fellows of the Royal Society, for naval officers and Admiralty officials, were conservative with a small c. If a map maker added fanciful, uncorroborated details to a new chart, it could lead a voyage astray. Not to mention ruin the artisan's reputation with customers and patrons. Geographic knowledge was a rare, valued commodity subject to considerable scrutiny, yet its very scarcity, depending on the region, also made those interested in global expansion more likely to trust in dubious sources. This balance of rigor and incredulity was compounded in the case of the world's largest and least known ocean. No scrap of information could be ignored, but not every scrap could also be believed, a Pacific paradox. So much for the grand interpretive overview. Let's now check out some examples. So on August 30th, 1669, Sir John Narborough was ordered, quote, to make a discovery both of the seas and coasts in that part of the world, and if it be possible, to lay the foundation of a trade, end quote. That part of the world were the coasts of Patagonia and in modern-day Chile and Argentina, an area nominally controlled by the Spanish and assumed by the British to be as rich as Peru to the north. His orders were prepared by the future James II, then Duke of York and Lord High Admiral, Prince Rupert, a Privy Councillor and a naval officer, the first Earl of Arlington, Secretary of State for the South, and the first Earl of Sandwich and the sixth Earl of Ossory, both politicians and experienced naval officers. In addition, King Charles II was well aware of the venture and, quote, His Majesty was pleased to give homage to the voyage, end quote. Narborough sailed out of the Downs in September of 1669, reached Valdivia, Chile in December of 1670, and returned to England via the Straits of Magellan in June of 1671, so a very rapid expedition. Discovery, as laid out in Narborough's instructions, referred to the need to take careful navigational measurements. Whereas every experienced naval officer was expected to keep a log and prepare sketch charts, the unknown geography of the Straits of Magellan and the South Seas made the careful recording of hydrographic and geographic information all the more important. Indeed, as Narborough had no luck in furthering trade with either indigenous Patagonians or Chilean settlers, his manuscript charts and journals became the most valuable outcomes of the voyage. Upon his return, the first thing Narborough did was to show his patrons his drafts, 3 of which I've shown on past slides. However, although he was trained in taking measurements and making sketches, Narborough was not schooled in creating cartographic works fit for sale, or even for presentation. Thus, it is likely that Narborough turned to, or was ordered to work with, chartmaker John Thornton, who in turn converted the manuscripts to a smaller print edition. He also helped to create the presentation charts that you see here. Thornton's engraved chart offered a wider audience than Admiralty administrators and royals, one of their first detailed glimpses of the Straits of Magellan. Despite the interest of the naval elite in Narborough's charts, these men did not push to have his journal published upon his return. The manuscript charts were kept as elite reference objects, while the printed chart was for sale for the general public. The Royal Navy did not venture into the South Seas again after the dubious results of Narborough's voyage, but they were still, of course, interested in learning as much about the Pacific as possible. When word reached England that buccaneers had captured a Spanish South Seas derrotero, the same men who planned Narborough's expedition took notice. I'm speaking now, of course, of the piratical voyage led, some of the time, by Bartholomew Sharp, which in turn led to a 1682 jury trial that was closely followed by the King of England and his elite circle. As an aside, one of the judges at Sharp's trial was the now Admiral John Narborough. The king ordered a translation and a copy made of the derrotero. It seems that Sharp had already had some connection with William Hacke, who set to work on the task. Hacke was one of the final members of the Thames School, which Alistair Muir already spoke to this group about, and another prominent member of the school was John Thornton, who helped to alter Narborough's drafts into printable charts. The initial Hacke wagoner for the king was certainly supposed to be a clandestine object intended for the eyes of only a few top officials, and there was certainly a lot of secrecy around the time of the trial in 1682. While not authorized to engrave the wagoner, and it's not clear it would have been economical to do so at the time, Hacke nevertheless saw an opportunity to net patronage via the limited circulation of copies in influential circles. For nearly 2 decades, he produced lavish presentation copies of the Sharp derrotero, and these are which we all study today and are so fascinating. The first of the atlases, and I don't have images of these, I apologize, are dedicated to King Charles II, who was also Lord High Admiral at the time. The choice of the king as an object of dedication is an obvious one. At this time, as shown in the case of the Narborough expedition and Sharp's trial, the king was directly involved in maritime affairs and had at least a passing interest in the South Seas. From the inclusion of his shop information, which is on hopefully your left, it is clear that Hacke knew these objects would be viewed by a larger audience than just the king, offering him a chance to gain new customers of the highest social rank. Kings and political configurations change over time. In 1685, Hacke presented a new copy to James II, which is the copy at the National Maritime Museum that you have seen images of on these slides. He was producing not for a mass market, but for a very small and powerful one. This particular Wagoner is one of the best preserved and the most extravagant, making it a good indicator of Hacke's goals in editing and copying rare information for elite eyes only. Other dedicatees included the second Duke of Albemarle, a patron of privateers and a colonial governor, and, upon his death, Lord Somers, a Lords Justice to the administrator of the kingdom. There is no evidence that any of the Wagoners were ever used to float. While other travel accounts were put aboard ships' libraries, these Wagoners, all folio in size and very heavy, if you ever had to put one on an archival table, were not intended for actual navigation. They were instead Hacke's way of navigating London's elite classes, to make work for himself and to establish a reputation as the chart maker of choice for the maritime community interested in overseas expansion. Hacke's later Wagoners included new information garnered from his many maritime and publishing contacts. Most instructive in understanding how geographic knowledge fluctuated over time is the invention of Pepys Island. So Ambrose Cowley sailed on a South Seas voyage in 1684 as sailing master. After capturing a Danish ship, the crew headed for the Straits of Magellan. When the eastern entrance proved difficult to enter, they opted instead to round the Horn. On the way south, in 47 degrees 40 minutes south latitude, the crew spotted uncharted land. In his manuscript journal, Cowley saw many woods and a great harbor. He writes, quote, "I would have had them stood upon a wind all night, but they told me they were not come out to go upon discovery. We saw likewise another island by this that night, which made me think of them as the Sibald de Wards," end quote. And the Sibald de Wards are a group of islands, supposedly near the Falklands, which are actually the Falklands. The islands receive no name in Cowley's manuscript, however. Cowley returned to England in 1686. In 1687, Hacke made a manuscript map, which you see here, of the island cited by Cowley, christened Pepys Island after the Secretary of the Navy, Samuel Pepys. In the title, Hacke claims that the island was named by Cowley, quote, "who called it after this name," end quote. There's also an Admiralty Bay on one of the two islands depicted, perhaps a bid by Cowley for a commission in the Navy, or by Hacke for more orders. Hacke exaggerated Cowley's favorable description of the island. Indeed, he doubles the estimate of the capacity of the harbor from 500 to 1,000 sails. Pepys Island was integrated into later editions of Hacke's Wagoner, as well as to printed maps by various makers. The island would stay a fixture on maps until the 1760s, when it was disproven. Whereas Hacke prepared presentation copies of luxury atlases for the elite, he also sold charts from his shop. His high-end atlases apparently were available for the astronomical sum of £70, and William Hill of Lincoln's Inn purchased one around 1693. Later, Hill sold this example to the South Sea Company in 1711, just as the latter was preparing a voyage to the South Seas. For many reasons, that voyage never sailed, but the transaction shows that Hacke's atlases retained relevance and reverence into the 18th century. By the late 1690s, Hacke's business seems to have been booming, and he looked to diversify by entering into the world of book publishing. This decision was likely influenced by the introduction of several similar books to the market at the same time. First, John Narborough's journal was finally published, not at the behest of the Royal Navy, but who still showed little interest in voyage accounts, but by 3 fellows of the Royal Society. Second, William Dampier, Sharp's fellow buccaneer, had released his first account to considerable acclaim. Not only was he wined and dined by London elites, he was also offered a naval commission to command his own South Seas voyage. The Admiralty was again interested in the South Seas, and here they prioritized a navigator's experience over naval service. Already seasoned at editing Buccaneers manuscripts, Hacke released his own voyage collection in 1699, entitled A Collection of Original Voyages. These voyages included, first, Captain Cowley's voyage around the globe, which you see the first page of here, Captain Sharp's journey over the Isthmus of Darien and into the South Seas, Captain Wood's voyage through the Straits of Magellan, which is a second journal from the Narborough expedition, and a Mr. Roberts' adventures among the corsairs of the Levant. The book was printed by James Knapton, who specialized in the production of South Seas accounts. He had published Dampier's account as well. Herman Moll drew the maps, as he did for Dampier's account and other South Seas books of this period. Whereas Hacke's foray into print was targeted at a much wider audience than his atlases, he was still dedicating the work to his patron, Lord Somers. He explains that the volume only, quote, came to public view under the patronage of your great name, doubting but the same innate goodness in your lordship that made it acceptable in the manuscript will render it no less so in the print, end quote. The positive reaction of a small audience who saw the manuscripts encouraged Hacke to share the journals more widely. Cowley and Sharp's voyages come first, followed by Wood's, whose work may be of use to, quote, help out the shortness of Sir John Narborough's relation, end quote. The final section, Roberts's, recounts his time on a Levant pirate corsair, which Hacke says allows a rare glimpse of the Greek Isles. Roberts, Sharp, and Cowley all tie the collection to the popularity of privateering and pirating. The word with the most entries in the index is buccaneer. Wood's inclusion, however, speaks to the Narborough naval expedition, published in 1694. Hacke seems to cover all the bases with this short collection, playing into perceived interests in buccaneering and in geographic novelty. Of Cowley, Hacke claims that, quote, he has published with very little alteration from the original journal given me by Captain Cowley, but for the ease of the reader, I have contracted it in such places as contained nothing but plain sailing, end quote. The same is said of Sharp's journal. Yet, both manuscripts show a much heavier editorial hand than Hacke claims. One example will have to suffice, an episode describing a storm while rounding Cape Horn. In his manuscript, Cowley writes, quote, we sailed until the 14th of February. There we judged that we had the length of Cape Horn lying in 57 degrees and 40 minutes south latitude, and longitude 303 degrees and no minutes, where we met with a great current, roaming from the northwest, we being very merry, having that night fair weather and good punch, and choosing Valentine's. But the next day, the wind round up at northwest blowing very hard, laying us under a main course. We laid her head to the southward and drove into 60 degrees and 20 minutes south latitude, end quote. In the published collection, it reads thus. Then hailing away southwest, we came abreast with Cape Horn the 14th day of February, where we choosing of Valentines and discoursing of the intrigues of women, there arose a prodigious storm, which did continue to the last day of the month, driving us into the latitude of 60 degrees and 30 minutes south, which is further than ever any ship hath sailed before south. So that we concluded that the discoursing of women at sea was very unlucky and occasioned the storm, end quote. While certainly more entertaining, Hacke corrected the latitude slightly and added a narrative anecdote not hinted at by Cowley beyond the mention of choosing Valentines. Such emendations do not mean that Hacke was remiss in his editorial work. On the contrary, he was typical of the mediation process that often took a journal from ship to printed sheets. And there's many similar examples to this in the Dampier manuscript journal and the printed account. Just as Narborough had to consult Thornton to create a printable map, so too did sailors like Cowley have to consult editors and other gatekeepers of the print industry. Sensing a further opportunity to cash in on the interest in the South Seas caused by his and other buccaneer publications, Hacke advertised in the March 5th to 7th, 1702 Postman, quote, whereas proposals have been lately published by William Hacke, hydrographer, for engraving all the whole coasts, islands, and co. from California to the Straits of Le Maire in the South Seas of America on 30 large copper plates, the whole to be done by Michaelmas next. The originals were from a survey ordered by a council of Panama for the use of the King of Spain's ships in those seas, end quote. Lamentably, Hacke disappears from the official records around the time of this advertisement. The details of his life at the end of his life remain a mystery. Hacke is the quintessential example of a middleman in the production of geographic knowledge, one that could gain patronage from elites with a luxury manuscript, while also courting a more general audience with print projects. He was connected to officials and intellectuals across London. So far, all of our actors have found their participation in the Geographic Knowledge Network beneficial. Promotion for Narborough, freedom for Sharp, professional reputation and patronage for Hacke, a command for Dampier. In the first and second case studies, the Royal Navy has been represented by the Sovereign, who is usually also the Lord High Admiral, and his closest advisors. However, in our final case study, we see a change in the command structure. From 1709, the Royal Navy was headed by an Admiralty office in commission. The Lord High Admiral and his commissioners were appointed officials who almost always had naval or foreign policy expertise. In 1739, determined to hinder Spanish trade in every corner of its empire, the British Admiralty and government officials planned the largest naval expedition to the Pacific to date, to be commanded by Commodore George Anson. At first glance, this was to be a sanctioned privateering mission, not unlike those of 30 years earlier, although the Admiralty would provide the ships and men rather than private merchants. In execution, however, the expedition became much more thanks to the ways in which it was presented in periodicals, magazines, and the official voyage account. To prepare for the voyage, commissioners of the Admiralty compiled all the information they could gather about the South Seas. This included the printed works of Dampier and other privateers, manuscript materials, although there's lamentably no evidence they looked at one of the Hacke atlases, and the testimony of South Seas and East India Company employees. The Admiralty managed to gather geographic knowledge in a crisis thanks to the communication hub of the Royal Navy. In addition, the significance of London allowed for in-person meetings and efficient transmission of proposals that traveled between Whitehall and private dwellings. In 1740, Anson sailed from England with orders to lead a squadron of 6 ships around Cape Horn to, quote, annoy and distress the Spaniards either at sea or land to the utmost of your power, end quote. Anson would do just that, looting along the Spanish coast and causing a wave of panic among colonial officials. However, he lost 1,400 of his 1,900 men, primarily to scurvy, as well as 5 of his 6 vessels. His reputation was saved when he seized a treasure galleon near the Philippines in 1743, which we see a painting of on this slide. For his efforts, Anson was appointed to the board of the Admiralty and hailed as the second coming of Francis Drake. Back in London, it took 4 years for Anson to compile his papers and direct the publication of the voyage account, which was written by his ship's chaplain, Richard Walter. He used Anson's personal materials and those of his officers to write the narrative, in which Anson's opinions are clearly laid out. In addition to Walter's recognized contribution on the title page, Benjamin Robbins, a Fellow of the Royal Society and a military engineer, also prepared parts of the text. The account was published by the Knaptons, the same printers who produced Hacke's collection. 4 editions of Anson's Voyage Around the World were published in 1748, the first published in May in quarto. The second, an octavo version, was released simultaneously. The third went on sale in June, the 4th in August, again both in octavo. Upon release, the story ran in serialized form in Gentleman's Magazine for 5 months. It was in its 15th edition in 1776. Dublin printings appeared immediately in 1748, with Boston editions in 1760 and 61. Abroad, the account enjoyed considerable circulation. It was translated into Dutch, French, and German in 1749, Russian in 1751, Italian in 1756, and Swedish in 1761. Never in Spanish, but that's a different story. All told, there were at least 44 editions printed across Europe in the 18th century, and the book was not just sold, but it was read. Henry Legge, a diplomat and brother to one of Anson's officers, wrote to Anson from Berlin in 1749, quote, all people here who have the least smattering of English, and many have, are at work with grammars and dictionaries to read over your South Sea voyage, end quote. The official account was popular because it outlined a thrilling story, the first British voyage to the South Seas in 30 years. but it also laid out a new policy towards British involvement in the South Seas. The official account was a manifesto about British imperial expansion and their assumed rights to Pacific space. The publication and popularity of this account would change the discourse surrounding what long-range exploratory expeditions were, how and why they should be carried out, and who was authorized to write about them. We see a definitive shift to the commander as author by this time, a trend that was quickened with Dampier and other privateers. Rather than a small octavo with sparse yet still helpful maps and plans, the folio edition included over 40 plates showing new and detailed maps, charts, plans, and views. And the original plates, of which there are 42, would be reprinted in every quarto edition that was printed. So that's the 1st, 5th, 9th, and 12th editions that came out across the 1750s. The official account was, let's skip that part, shall we? Okay. Of course, not everyone appreciated this forceful declaration of geographic knowledge that was also a statement of imperial intent. And if you heard Rainer Bushman's talk, some of this rhetoric will sound familiar. The Spanish forcefully disagreed with the editorial content of the Anson account, as well as were disturbed by the geographic information that the work shared. It was not new information to the Spanish, but it was information that they had previously assumed that only they knew. When Anson tried to plan an exploratory voyage into the South Seas in 1749, the Spanish minister Carvajal responded, quote, that neither he nor anyone else could be a stranger to the rise and intent of such an expedition, since it was so fully explained in the printed relation of Lord Anson's voyage, end quote. Such an expedition did not sail during Anson's tenure as Lord High Admiral. He died in 1762. They were fulfilled in the series of voyages of the 1760s that culminated in James Cook's first voyage to the Pacific. The format of Anson's account and the direct participation of the Admiralty in arranging publication of the voyage's journals was preserved in this later period. To turn back to our examples, however, what conclusions can be drawn about the production of Pacific geographic knowledge to 1750? First, it is important not to diminish manuscript materials in the rush to examine the history of the book. Hacke's manuscript atlases were not charming throwbacks to an earlier era, nor were they idiosyncratic anomalies. They were targeted products made for a specialized audience amidst an atmosphere of trans-imperial tension over the possession of geographic knowledge. They existed easily alongside a plethora of print and material objects required by a prosperous maritime economy. They were an innovative response to a particular situation, a sign that the practice of chart making was dynamic and flourishing at the turn of the 18th century. Second, by 1750, it is possible to see the coalescing of a network of private individuals, institutions, and government bodies who together dictated the ways in which geographic knowledge was packaged and circulated. Mapmakers, government officials, and intellectuals worked together interdependently, yet also informally, in London. Indeed, the very density of the city allowed for the interactions necessary to create geographic objects that were of use to a specialized and at the same time a general audience. In the case of the Pacific, these objects had to have these dual audiences due to the paucity of information about the world's largest ocean. However, as seen in the earlier examples, this network was not generated randomly or completely. It was knitted together over a century of experimentation with exploration of the Pacific and with their textual outputs of those voyages. In the case of Narborough, his manuscript charts were celebrated by elite naval and government officials, although they were not stylistically appropriate to a general audience. With the help of John Thornton, Narborough was able to produce a printed map that had openly shared the geographic findings of his voyage, while more closely following accepted cartographic convention. His charts were the main outcome of the voyage, and his journal was not considered of sufficient interest or additional value to publish in the 1670s. Only in 1694, as part of a voyage collection aimed at promoting the Royal Society's role as an intellectual repository, was it printed. In the 1680s and 1690s, William Hacke produced his atlases at the behest of and in an attempt to attract an elite audience. These manuscript works furthered his reputation as a skilled practitioner and also gained him customers. Hacke used his central placement in Wapping and his considerable contacts in government and in the docks to gather information that he could leverage to his advantage. Later, in an attempt to widen his customer base further, he also entered into the voyage collection market, a field then crowded with buccaneer authors eager to gain fame and fortune. One such buccaneer had this strategy work. Dampier was given a naval commission, although his poor command skills meant a later court-martial and a decision that he was not fit to serve in the Crown's ships. The experience with Dampier cooled the Admiralty in its pursuit of civilian commanders, but it did not stop future naval officers from using earlier works as sources. Anson, for example, heavily cites both Dampier and Narborough. Additionally, the enduring utility and popularity of the late 17th and early 18th century Pacific voyage accounts alerted naval officials to the benefits of controlling the portrayal of such voyages in print. By the time of the Anson circumnavigation, the voyage account had become understood as a way not only to share geographic knowledge for personal gain, but also as a way to proclaim national pride and imperial policy. By 1750, Britain saw itself as a major player in the Pacific, and their representative, George Anson, said as much in the pages of his account. Their rivals would, of course, disagree, but saying that what they knew and what they intended in a publicly available and widely translated text created a sense of credibility about Britain's role in a future Pacific. Without Narborough and Hacke, I argue, we would not have an Anson voyage account. It is important to recover the experimentation in the form and process of publication that existed prior to the colonization of the Pacific in the late 18th century. If we defamiliarize ourselves with what we think a voyage account should be, we can grasp the trans-imperial competitive collaboration that underwrote the creation of maps, charts, globes, and books. While the London-centered network outlined here came to prominence in the period 1670 to 1750, they did not do so in a vacuum or without local and transnational input and resistance. Making the Pacific seem to be a viable option for European expansion was a centuries-long process that involved innovation in diplomacy, navigation, shipbuilding, but also in the creation and circulation of geographic knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that wonderful talk. Fortunately, we do have ample time for questions. ¿Algunas preguntas?
I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
There you go.
So I'll begin with a question, if I may, which is about Hacke's interest in print publication. And I found it interesting that with his collection of voyages, he didn't make the maps himself, which seems to point to a lack of experience with print. And yet in the advertisement you showed us, he does seem to be moving in that direction. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, how very tantalizing that advertisement is. If we get the Derritero printed, or if he's found another source that he's hinting at, it's not quite clear. I think that the voyage collection is very much an attempt to make some easy money. He already had access to all of these voyage accounts, particularly Sharp and Cowley, and also he seems to have had a very close relationship with John Wood, who also went on a voyage to find the Northeast Passage earlier, and Hacke was aware of and working with that. So I think he had all these materials to hand, and in order to play into the larger genre that he saw being created, I think he thought Herman Moll was a safer bet, was more familiar. As we all know, Herman Moll has a very distinct style to his maps, and I think Hacke was wily enough to realize that would catch the attention of readers. But I also think there is something to what you're saying about him being more of a trained chart maker that manuscript was primarily his area of expertise and had worked well for him in his career to this point, and that there might have been a learning curve with engraving that he was not quite prepared to take on. But I'm sure Alistair can speak more clearly about the Thames School and the manuscript to print jump that's going on. Clearly that is happening, but I wouldn't want to say that it's an easy thing to do for someone who's more used to one medium to suddenly be creating saleable objects in the other medium.
Alistair, do you want to jump in here? Oh.
Don't feel like you have to though. Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Other question? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much for your talk. Sorry, I can't put my image, but because my internet is not very good, but I find very interesting your conclusions about these networks that were not really so formal. Well, I think they were actually formal in some countries, perhaps in England and in the Low Countries, more or less formal, but that they were even transnational. And well, I wanted to ask you about, well, in one hand, your opinion on how these networks like shifted the interest of England from the American continent towards the Pacific or the Pacific Islands, because apparently in the 16th century and perhaps during the 17th century as well, English and Dutch were very interested in the new continent, but once they crossed to the Pacific by the Pacific to the east of Asia, apparently because of what happened later, they started little by little to be more present in the southeast of Asia. It's just a perception. I don't know what you think about it. And the last one, you said that all this information, geographical information, was not translated to Spanish, and it was another story. I know, I can imagine why, but I would like to ask you if you can tell us something about that. Thank you very much.
Definitely, that's one of my favorite stories. So let's start with the first kind of area you brought up. I think that, yes, it's very important that we realize that there's regionalization going on when we're talking about the South Seas and the Pacific, and that the open water Pacific is very different than something like more of a coastal area, which is arguably what the Buccaneers are reporting on and what the Derritero is showing. And Natalia can speak actually a lot more too about the idea of an Eastern Pacific area. But I think that with the English, in the first part of from about 1670, and the reason we start there is that is the first time the Navy does send an expedition into the South Seas. The Narborough expedition is the first time that the Royal Navy is actually involved. Prior to that, with Francis Drake and with Thomas Cavendish, both of those are going to be privateering expeditions, but also they're going to be funded by these private companies. And that's prior to the late 17th century. Anything that we might now call exploration, that's not a word that they would have used at the time, anything we would call that is going to be funded by these private companies. And it's only in the late 17th century that we see the Royal Navy starting to get interested in this, which is interesting because by the late 18th century, the Royal Navy absolutely runs anything we would call exploration to both the Northwest Passage, but also into and across the Pacific. So I'm interested in how the Navy comes, I guess, to be that dominant in the planning of voyages, but then also, as we noticed, they're involved in the printing of voyages. So I think that the shift from a coastal littoral to the Pacific over the West is explained, as most things are, by the China trade. All that England wants to do, all the Dutch want to do, is to get to the East Asian trade faster. The English are particularly desperate for this, and we see that in the late 16th and then 17th century voyages to find a northwest and in some cases a northeast passage. And the English really dominate those searches, and that's their main area of focus of kind of venture capitalism at this point, besides the East India Company, is to send the Muscovy Company and other company ships up and trying to get over into the open Pacific. So the interest in the open Pacific is never in the Pacific itself. They're not, they might think there's a Terra Australis, but I tend to actually agree with Rainer Bushman and would almost push it farther that not too many of any Europeans, much less the Spanish, really believed in a Terra Australis incognita by the late 17th century. I think they've understood that that is shrunk in their minds to a much smaller, more likely an island area. And it's only with the discovery of Tahiti that we're going to see that get a different sort of exoticization and a different sort of energy in terms of the Pacific itself, the sea, the ocean, having any sort of interest, as opposed to prior to that, there's interest in the American littoral in order to take money from Spanish settlers. And then there's interest in getting across the Pacific as fast as possible to get to the Philippines, to get to the East India trade. So the Pacific is an obstacle until really, I think, the 1760s, if we're going to talk about perceptions, the wider perceptions there, to build on Rainer Bushman's work intensely. And then real quick, why they didn't publish. So Spain doesn't have as robust a domestic print industry as other European nations like France, the Dutch, and even England do, for many reasons that have to do with that every city had its own print industry, which meant that no one print industry got huge. They have dual languages in the Iberian Peninsula. So there's a lot of reasons that the Spanish print industry wasn't as strong in terms of output as other areas. But there's also that censorship that continues to go on into the 18th century. And so the Anson account is immediately brought to Spanish attention. They read it in mostly the French translation, but some of them also read it in the English, and they're absolutely furious about it, and immediately take it up with their ambassador in London, with the ambassador to Madrid, is in a lot of grief at this point. His letters are hilarious during this period because he's kind of like, what have you done to me? And so they actually do order a translation to be made, which is unusual. Usually the Spanish domestic consumer market depended on French translations and imported French texts. But for this one, they are actually preparing a Spanish translation that is not only a direct translation, but in the margins, it's going to contain direct refutation of all of the claims that Anson makes. So word for word says, oh, this isn't actually a discovery. We Spanish knew this hundreds of years before. And so it's going to be this kind of revolutionary roast of Anson. But the surviving text is only about 2/3 of the way done. And so something happens halfway through the text, and it's not entirely clear from the manuscript what happened. It's a priest who's preparing this, but there's something with surviving documents that we do have. There's something that happens with getting the privilege and with getting this through the censors that then the translation project falls apart, and it's kept in the archive until really the 19th century, that it's then actually actively translated, but without the kind of vitriol and the urgency that it was being prepared. So it's a great what if moment. If the Spanish had actually hit back at this point, how would that affected the 1760s voyages? I think that's a really crucial moment where things really could have been different in the trans-imperial interplay over Pacific politics.
Thank you. I would think that maybe the 16th century voyages were not so like independent from the Royal Navy, because well, I have been working with Hacke and and the voyages of Drake, Hawkins, and Cavendish particularly, and I see well Elizabeth II was very involved in many of these voyages, but well, it's just maybe like the beginning, and
no, she directly makes money off of it. She's an investor, even though she says she isn't, and is like, oh, you're terrible, Drake, but then she pockets money off of it.
Yeah,
so she's involved. So I'm not saying they're not elite voyages. They're certainly elite, but I wouldn't say they're Royal Naval voyages in the way we understand that, because the Royal Navy itself is a more modern bureaucratic administration, and the way in which the Navy, in terms of the manning of the Navy and the command structure of the Navy, is actually run in the 16th century is very, very different than it starts to be in the late 17th and the 18th century onward. So I'd argue that what we call a Royal Navy in the 16th century is actually much less kind of organized than many naval historians would like us to think. It's not quite as thought out all the time. And Drake definitely, when he goes, assumes that if he succeeds, it's going to go well for him. But then he is also accused of piracy, and in general, it's a privateering voyage. So there's a lot of definitional slippage that happens kind of the farther back you go when we're dealing with more modern institutional definitions of what a navy is and things like that.
Yeah, apparently the Battle of 1588 was a shift, but sorry, I won't hold you.
Providential wind and all that. Yeah, they just got lucky. No, it's definitely it's a different situation all the way. Not to say they didn't have amazing ships and were good sailors. Would never disparage that.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
If I may, hi, Kathy. That was a fantastic talk, and I'm new to the group and relatively new to the hacks as well. And thanks, Chet, for inviting me today. But I found your discussion about the hack atlases as luxury items fascinating, and you mentioned specifically that there is no evidence that these wagoners were used to float. And I wonder what is the evidence? Is it just a negative evidence, or you know, the Rotero obviously was as bulky, you know, as large as the hack. So I wonder, how do we know that the hacks were not used for that purposes? And if this is the case, do we know what was used in these 2 decades between 1680 and 1700s? Was there a portable hack? I mean, obviously that information would have been very useful to the navigators.
Right. I mean, in truth, yes, it is negative evidence. So we don't, I would love to know precisely what derrotero they used, as would all of us. I do imagine, based on seeing other derroteros that did go to sea, that those are actually smaller volumes. So they're not a folio size. They'd be much slimmer and a bit long. And then bound together that way, so that you would just get the coastal views kind of almost in a strip map format. Are those that actually went to sea that I have seen. I'm not saying they all were like that at all, but only the ones I've seen in archives. The sheer size of them, I also think, argues against them being used at sea. Judging from other ships' libraries, taking heavy folio items, a lot of people took folio or quarto sized objects to sea, and a lot of times that would include a bound chart, because you would want the chart or a rolled chart that could be an oilskin, because you would need to protect them from getting wet. But those would all very often be very slim volumes, so I can't imagine taking any of the hack ones with how thick they are, because they'd immediately get wet and be ruined. And correct, I don't know if anyone has seen any evidence that they went to sea. I've never seen anything in terms of most of them have pretty pristine pages. It's really heavy paper. It's just way too much of an investment to have ever thought it would go to sea. Not to say that some of them aren't very damaged. The John Carter Brown Library has some very bad leak through of the pigment and the inks. And it's also all in grayscale, which is like a sad hack volume, but that one is very different. But I've certainly never seen examples or thought that they could ever be taken to sea. It just wouldn't be practical. But that doesn't mean someone didn't try. Maybe on the royal yacht. Maybe one went on a royal yacht at some point.
Very good. Other questions?
There is a question in the chat, I think.
Oh, okay.
Chat.
Yes, Andrea.
Yes. Kathy, thanks very much for your talk. I have a question, not a question. I would like to know something more about when you wrote in your PowerPoint about credulity and incredulity was especially precarious. I would like to hear a little bit more about this situation.
Sure.
What was right, what was false, deliberately false in the maps.
Sure. I don't think there's usually too much in maps that are deliberately false. There are, of course, examples of that, but a lot of what we now see is kind of the chimeras or the fanciful or mythical objects usually have a pretty good explanation of how they got there. For example, the island of California Australia is still an island, don't worry. The island of California kind of comes about due to misunderstandings, misreadings of Vizcaino, and then it snowballs, as often does in something like map making, where it's compilation and comparison. Once someone does print it, someone else is going to see it, and then it goes from there. Something like Pepys Island is an interesting case because it's a strategic choice. So once Pepys Island makes its way onto maps, and it's really Herman Moll's printed maps of the South Seas accounts that really solidify Pepys Island as an actual thing, that is kept on maps not so much as a way for navigators to avoid the island or so they don't run into it. It's itty bitty and you can easily avoid that part of the ocean. It's kept because it might actually be a strategic watering point by which the French are very interested in as well, French and British ships could stop on their way around the Horn. So Pepys Island is kept there in kind of a hope that it's real, because if it's real, maybe then these navies, these states, privateers, pirates, whoever wants, can use it. And we see several other islands in the South Seas that are also holdovers from earlier times, or maybe the longitude wasn't reported well, but they're kept on maps kind of in the hopes that they might one day prove true and therefore prove strategic. So that's just one example where I actually think that those things are held on to by map makers, usually for strategic reasons, for reasons of not wanting to say it's not there and then it is, and someone runs into it and then their maps are considered terrible. That's not good for business. So I think there's usually more practical reasons these things carry on, with obviously the large exception of the immense size of something like Terra Australis Incognita on earlier world maps leading into the 17th century. But by the late 17th century, we really see those shrinking away as well, especially around Cape Horn, where after the Lemaire and Schouten expedition shows that the Horn is there, you really see very quickly the shores of Terra Australis Incognita moving away from Tierra del Fuego. And so I think the Pacific is important in this case, because in general, I think that is true, what I've said about credulity and incredulity, that there's a fine balance that a map maker had to approach, because he doesn't want to not include something important, but some things are a bit wacky. But I think that the incredulity gets stretched a lot more with an area like the Pacific, and a very similar area would be at this point the Arctic. So I think there's a lot more willingness to hypothesize in those areas, or to include more guesswork than they would in somewhere like the East Indies or in the Indian Ocean. So I think it does have to do with proximity to the amount of information, and also the proximity of the actual space to anyone that could kind of go test whatever you're doing. And so I think these spaces of credulity shift over time. And in the 18th century, it's really the Pacific. And then into the 19th century, it's going to be more the Arctic, where we have those areas where we're really unclear. And then obviously later, it's going to be Antarctica as the last one, where they're really willing to make more wild guesses as opposed to little guesses as map makers in terms of their practice.
Other questions?
What was the one in the chat? I did not see that one.
Okay. It's from Carmen, and she says, I loved your presentation. Thank you very much. I would like to know how government institutions related to these commercial cartographers. I mean, weren't there a direction for the work of these men that meets the needs of the Admiralty?
Right, so I'll answer this just narrowly in terms of England, and the answer is no. No, the Admiralty does not issue standards, and it's quite amazing to me that they do this. They are the last major overseas empire to get a centralized repository. That's 1795. That's when the Hydrographic Office begins. They don't even issue maps until the early 19th century. They're not able to do that. And it's really around 1820, they start actually printing their own charts and selling them to the public. So they are so late compared to someone like the Spanish, who have the Casa by the beginning of the 16th century, that is doing a lot of those things, including pilot tests and things like that. So England really depends on this informal gentleman's agreement between private map makers and the Admiralty. And I think a lot of this has to do with how top heavy England is, so that triangle gets real narrow towards the top and the king and the elites and things like that. And a lot of these elites do have a lot of duties, and there's a lot of honor involved about having a good map or the Royal Society being a repository. So there's just a lot of handshakes and hoping it works out. But then also they have really good training for their sailors. And Margaret Scotty can talk about this better than I can. So the system, although it looks kind of scattered and random, does seem to work out for them. So they keep going with it. But you do see tweaks here and there. We see the professionalization of the Navy from about 1670 onward, with the solidification of the Admiralty Board, with a move to professional officers and away from gentlemen's. So this is the gentlemen's versus the tarps debate, the tarpaulins. So we do see the Navy specifically realizing that there are certain bureaucratic shifts they can make that will help them to be more efficient and to be more powerful. But really the last one to click into place for them will be cartography, which is absolutely different than any other European overseas empire. And it is kind of amazing.
Other questions? I'll ask one more, if I may, which is, I wonder, Katie, the vitriolic Spanish annotations to the translation of Anson's account of his voyage, have those been studied?
There's been a couple of articles on them, and then I am hopefully going to publish one soon, depending on how other projects go, but they haven't, there's no book link study on them or anything. Okay. But it is something that perhaps the Hakluyt Society would be interested in publishing, kind of with the English text right next to the Spanish. I think that would be a really fun project to take on. They're at the Real Academia in Spain, so they are available, and they have digitized them because they did it for me. So if you get in touch with them, they do have it, and it is available for sure. It's a really interesting document. I've looked at that mostly in terms of ideas of translation in the 18th century and what it means to translate an object.
Great. Are there any, is there any last question? It seems not, so perhaps you can join me in thanking Katie for her presentation. And thank you all for coming. And we all look forward to continuing this series and continuing our conversation about the Hacke atlases, related derroteros, and activities in the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. See you guys.
Thank you.